Today our topic is women on the Russian throne. And in the previous lessons, you often heard from me that only males could inherit the throne, and now we'll have actually several decades with mostly women in charge. So let's see what changed and how it all turned out. So, after Peter the Great's death, succession became complicated again. It wasn't that long after the time of troubles, and people still remembered very clearly what had happened when there was no stable ruler. Russia nearly collapsed into chaos. Foreign powers invaded, elites fought each other, and the state became weak and unstable. So, after that experience, Russian political culture became very focused on one idea: there must always be a ruler firmly in charge. But unlike the earlier dynastic crisis, when the Rurik dynasty ceased to exist, the Romanov dynasty survived this time thanks to the changes that Peter the Great himself set in motion. Now, remember, he basically killed his son Alexei, and Alexei died in prison after torture, and the torture was ordered by his own father. So, after that tragedy, Peter issued the decree of succession to the throne, and this decree basically said that the Tsar now can write it in his will who will inherit the throne. And basically, the decree abolished the succession based on gender and age, so the oldest male, and actually really made it flexible with the degree of the family connection. And that made it possible for his wife, Yekaterina, or in English, Catherine, to inherit the throne after him. Now, in the last lesson, I also told you that Peter did not finish writing his will before he died. But Yekaterina, or Catherine, was supported by the nobility who really wanted to avoid losing political stability again. So Catherine the First on the throne created a precedent. And now we enter a very interesting new period in Russian history, the era of women on the throne. And as always, in this overview, I will be covering this period pretty briefly. So during this period of time, Peter's bloodline continued through direct descendants and other relatives connected to his family. And one of the tsarins of this period was his niece Anna, who brought strong German influence into the Russian court, and she ruled the country in a very European style. Later, so not right after Anna, but later came Elizabeth of Russia. And she actually was the daughter of Peter the Great. And technically, Elizabeth had a very strong dynastic claim because she was Peter's daughter by bloodline. But even so, she still had to rely on a military-supported coup in order to secure the throne. But she did, and once in power, she received a lot of support from the elite. And Elizabeth she was actually very similar in personality to her father, Peter the Great, and she continued many of Peter's westernizing traditions. But there was one important difference. Peter focused heavily on military reform and administration, and you remember the navy and the shipbuilding, industrialization, and state modernization. But the women rulers who followed him, they also were westernizing the country, but they focused much more on aristocratic court culture and on introducing Russia to luxurious European lifestyles. And especially under Elizabeth, the Russian imperial court became deeply influenced by European aristocratic fashion and customs. So the nobility adopted elaborate clothing. Palaces and ceremonies became more luxurious. There were imported foods and grand, beautiful balls. Overall, Russian aristocratic culture became increasingly European. And it's a good place to ask about the ordinary people. Did their life improve? And here I'm just going to be quick. Mostly no. Actually, no, it did not. Because again, luxurious courts and aristocratic lifestyles required enormous wealth, and that money came largely from taxation and the labor of the peasants. So the landowners wanted more production, more profit, and more labor from the people living on their land. And as a result, conditions for peasants continued getting worse. And now we will begin seeing something historically very important: large-scale peasant uprisings all across Russia. Now, earlier in the Russian history, there had certainly been isolated local revolts and even big-scale uprisings, but they usually centered around a specific reason. But now, peasant resistance expresses the overall dissatisfaction with what is going on. And historically, we already saw how Russian peasants often endured extremely difficult conditions for long periods of time. But patience has its limits. So during this period, we begin seeing waves of peasant uprisings and small-scale rebellions directed against landlords and kind of like overall social system itself. But let's go back to Elizabeth. Her focus was somewhere else. She clearly understood the dangers of a succession crisis, like many people at this time. So, childless herself, Elizabeth decided to secure the succession early. She announced that her nephew, Peter, or in Russian, Pyotr, that will be his name in Russian traditions, would become the next ruler after her death. Now, this guy was actually a German prince. But once the decision was made, he was brought to Russia at a young age and against his will. And he hated it. He hated Russia, he hated the climate, he hated being separated from his beloved Germany, he hated the language, he hated the traditions, pretty much anything Russia related, he hated. And his main obsession was the Prussian military. And Prussia, which sounds very similar to Russia, was a German state that first was called the Kingdom of Prussia, and that will later become the German Empire. So Prussia was really the only thing Peter truly cared about. So Elizabeth realized very quickly that Peter would probably not become a very good ruler for Russia. So she decided that one way to ensure the succession was to arrange a marriage for him quickly so he could produce an heir to the throne, still based on Peter's bloodline. So a young German princess was brought to Russia for this specific purpose, and her original name was Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst. But after arriving in Russia, she converted to Orthodoxy, learned Russian, and she took the Russian name Yekaterina, or Catherine, and she will later be known as Catherine the Great. Now, unlike her husband, Peter, Catherine actually genuinely liked Russia. She learned the language extremely well, she adapted to Russian culture pretty quickly, she converted sincerely, or at least convincingly, to Orthodoxy, and she gradually became deeply connected to Russian and political cultural life. In many ways, she understood Russia far better than her future husband ever did, and that's exactly what she was projecting to people around her. Now, officially, Catherine's main responsibility was kind of simple: produce a male heir to the throne. But the marriage itself was deeply unhappy because Peter showed pretty much zero interest in his wife, and he remained obsessed with his own personal little hobbies. So eventually, Catherine did give birth to a son, and that will be the future Paul I of Russia, or Pavel I. And at that point, there were rumors questioning the child's true paternity, but officially he was recognized as Peter's son. Now, during all this time, Catherine was quietly building political influence for herself because she understood something very early on. If Peter became emperor, and he would, she would lose favor. And that was a very likely scenario because he pretty much hated her. So if that happened, she would be removed from court, she would be isolated, and probably forced into a convent, which was a pretty common fate for noble women during this period of time. So while Elizabeth was alive, Catherine spent years carefully building alliances among nobles and officers and some influential political circles. Catherine was intelligent and educated, and she presented herself as culturally Russian, unlike her husband, and politically very reliable. So by the time Elizabeth died, Catherine already had significant support with the elite. Peter III became emperor briefly after Elizabeth's death, but he was deeply unpopular. So many nobles disliked him because of his open admiration of Prussia, and that was the enemy of Russia, I should have mentioned, and his basically open hatred to everything Russian. So soon after, a coup was organized with support from powerful aristocratic and military groups, and Peter III was overthrown and died as a result of this coup. Officially, the public was told that he died naturally, but since it came a bit out of nowhere, rumors started spreading pretty much right away that it was too suspicious. But these theories didn't really go anywhere, and the elites supported Catherine in becoming the next empress. And historically, it's very interesting because Catherine the Great was ethnically German and did not belong to the Romanov dynasty bloodline by birth. But there was already a precedent with the previous Catherine, or Ekaterina the First, the wife of Peter the Great, who assumed the throne after his death. So it worked. But it also worked because Catherine had very successfully positioned herself as the protector of the Romanov dynasty, and overall supporter of the stability. And as I said before, Catherine was highly intelligent and deeply interested in ideas and learning. And we know that she was especially fascinated with philosophy of enlightenment. She even corresponded with major French Enlightenment thinkers and philosophers such as Voltaire and Diderot, and she embraced many liberal ideas about education and administration and state governance. As a result, French cultural influence became enormous in Russia during her reign. And by the late 18th century, many Russian aristocrats spoke French fluently and sometimes even better than Russian. And French language and culture became symbols of elite status. At the same time, like many Russian rulers before her, Catherine focused on territorial expansion. During her reign, Russia gained access to the Black Sea and really expanded in the region. And that was a major victory for the Russian Empire. So, here's another good time to ask, what about the common people? Did their life get better or worse under Catherine? And actually, by that time in the lecture, most students just simply select worse because that has been the correct answer so far. But most of them struggle to explain why. Again, why? Catherine seems to be a very progressive leader with good ideas, some liberal ideas. But the answer is, again, it became worse. If you remember what I just told you about how Catherine got the throne, you will realize that her main allegiance was with the elite. Because without their loyalty, it would be very difficult for a non-Romanov, ethnically German woman to stay on the throne. So this was the time when peasants became even more dependent on landowners. You might ask, how? So under Catherine, they lost the right to complain to higher authorities about their landlords. Now, to be fair, Catherine did introduce some reforms in education and administration, medicine, and in some other areas. At least early in her reign, she genuinely tried to implement some of these Enlightenment-inspired ideas into reforms. But that all changed dramatically after 1789, when the French Revolution began. So here, suddenly all of these liberal Enlightenment ideas that Catherine admired before no longer seemed harmless, because the French Revolution showed that these ideas about liberty and equality and political reform could eventually threaten the monarchy itself. And for Catherine, this became very, very scary. After the French Revolution, she moved away from many kind of like liberal tendencies that she had and became much more conservative and authoritarian. At that point, preserving autocracy and protecting the monarchy became far more important to her than her previous experimentation with some liberal ideas. And here I want to mention another very important event in Russian history. It was a rebellion organized by Yemelyan Pugachev. Now, earlier we talked about how Catherine the Great became increasingly focused on centralizing power. And one of her goals was to impose stronger administrative control across the entire empire. But Russia was enormous, and because it was so large, there were still somewhat independent regions that preserved a high degree of local autonomy. And one of those regions was in the south and kind of like southwest of the empire, and this region was heavily associated with the Cossacks. Now, depending on the historical interpretation, Cossacks can be described either as a distinct ethnic community or as a special military social group. But actually, for this overview, neither matters. But what's important for our purposes is this: the Cossacks traditionally valued local freedom and self-government very strongly. So even while being part of the Russian Empire, they often governed many local affairs themselves, and they also selected their own leaders. Catherine tried to bring these regions under tighter imperial control, And and basically the state began interfering more directly in the selection of the Cossack leaders. And not surprisingly, many Cossacks deeply resented it. And this happened at exactly the same time um, as peasants across Russia were becoming increasingly dissatisfied. So now different forms of unrest started kind of like connecting together. And that environment helped create Pugachev's uprising or rebellion. In many ways, this became the first large-scale civil conflict in Russian history. And Yemelyan Pugachev managed to gather a massive following made up of Cossacks and peasants and other people who were dissatisfied with what was going on. And his forces grew so large that they became a serious threat to the state. According to some sources, the numbers actually reached 120,000 people at its peak, and that's a lot of people. And this raises an important question, and that's exactly why I bring up this topic here. How did Yemelyan Pugachev convince so many people to follow him? Remember what we discussed earlier about the time of troubles? During that period, several imposters were quite successful because they claimed to be the surviving members of the royal bloodline. And actually, the same happened here again. Pugachev claimed that he was actually Peter III of Russia, Catherine the Great's supposedly dead husband, who had survived and returned to reclaim the throne. And that claim mattered enormously because, as I keep telling you, for centuries, Russian political culture and mindset had been built around loyalty to bloodline. And the Orthodox Church and the state had been reinforcing the idea that the legitimate rulers possessed a special God-given status. So rather than presenting himself simply as a rebel, Pugachev presented himself as a true Tsar, returning to restore justice. And that was what helped him gain this widespread support. Now, militarily, the uprising was ultimately no match for Catherine's professional army, and the regular army crushed the rebellion. Pugachev was captured, brought to Moscow, and publicly executed. And then the state put a lot of effort into spreading this news, the news of the execution, throughout all of the empire as a warning against future revolts. And that basically quieted down the people for a while. But even though the uprising failed, it revealed something extremely important. The dissatisfaction with the state was becoming very, very widespread, even though, as I said, it went into hiding after Pugachev's execution. But from this point forward, tension between the state and ordinary people would continue growing stronger and stronger. After Catherine the Great died, the next Romanov finally came to the throne, Paul I of Russia, and he was the son of Peter III and Catherine the Great. Now, Paul grew up hearing constant rumors that his mother had been involved in his father's death. And as a result, he deeply resented Catherine. So one of the first things Paul did was issue a new law of succession, stating that, again, only males could inherit the Russian throne. Now, there were some loopholes for women to still have an opportunity to inherit the throne, but basically that decree meant that the era of women rulers in Russia effectively came to an end. And we're going to stop here, and next time we're going to cover the Romanov emperors all the way up to, but not including, the last Russian emperor, Nicholas II. Thank you.